Tonight, we embark on a mesmerizing voyage into one of history's most merciless seasons, the infamous deep freeze of 1709. A winter of such unrelenting chill that mighty waterways locked into unyielding sheets of ice, loaves of bread hardened like unyielding rock inside hearths, and the very breath drawn into lungs prickled like shards of glass against exposed flesh. Picture the scene: a vast shroud of unrelenting white smothering the continent, hamlets vanishing under drifts that muffled all life, and kinfolk clustered in shadowed dwellings expending every ounce of resolve to survive yet another shadowed hour. This wasn't merely a spell of harsh climate. It was an ordeal, a profound crucible of survival that gripped untold multitudes in its vice. Before we plunge deeper into this icy realm, allow me to extend a heartfelt invitation to you. Whether you're tuning in from the bustling coasts of North America, the rolling hills of the Old World, the vibrant expanses of the East, the sun-baked plains of the South, or a distant isle beyond the horizon, it's a delight to have you with us this evening.
Drop a note in the comments about your corner of the globe and the hour marking your day. Are you easing into slumber as the world quiets, or savoring this tale amid the hush of midnight's embrace? If these soothing explorations of the past resonate with you, give the video a thumbs up, hit subscribe for future installments, and weave your reflections into the discussion below. Your support fuels more of these tranquil, evocative narratives. Now, pause for a beat, find your spot, fluff that cushion, draw a soft coverlet close, perhaps steep a mug of herbal infusion, or kindle a gentle flame. Let the clamor of daily life dissolve into the ether. Once settled, shut your eyes, draw in a slow, grounding breath, and join me as we cross the threshold into the crystalline awakening of 1709. That inaugural dawn in January arrived with an otherworldly hush, as if the land itself revered the grip of silence. The sun ascended hesitantly above a bleached skyline, its rays diluted and feeble, struggling to pierce the veil of lingering haze.
All creation lay encased in a luminous pallor, not the feathery drifts of a mild flurry, but a razor-edged rime that armored every surface in a shimmering veneer. Chimneys and thatches gleamed as if powdered with pulverized quartz, while skeletal limbs of oaks and elms bore crystalline sheaths that tinkled softly with the barest whisper of breeze, a sound like distant wind chimes forged in fragility. Across the dispersed settlements of the continent, from the fog-shrouded moors of England to the frost-laced vineyards of France, and northward to the fjord-girt shores of Scandinavia, dwellers stirred reluctantly from slumber, their chambers chilled to the marrow, exhalations blooming into spectral vapors that lingered like wraiths. Timber planks beneath bare soles crackled with embedded frost, and venturing outdoors delivered a jolt like stepping onto anvil steel, the bite seeping through threadbare soles to numb the bones. Husbandmen ventured forth to tend their beasts, discovering them clustered in quivering masses, plumes of vapor curling from nostrils, hides encrusted in hoarfrost that weighed them down like chainmail.
Troughs and ewers stood as monoliths of ice, their shattering echoes piercing the crisp void like hammer strikes on frozen forges. The aroma of kindling sparks drifted lazily, intertwining with the pristine, acerbic tang of sub-zero air, evocative of starched cotton sheets, yet laced with a sharpness that clawed at the sinuses. Tranquility reigned, but of a foreboding sort. Avian choruses fell mute. Hounds withheld their vigilant calls. Even the communal pumps loomed inert, their cords rigid as frozen sinew. As wayfarers crossed paths on rutted lanes, their eyes met in wordless apprehension. This surpassed an ordinary snap of winter. It pulsed with a vital malice, as if the earth had inhaled sharply and refused to exhale. Thus unfolded the inaugural hours of that legendary chill, a harbinger of woes that would etch themselves into chronicles for centuries, claiming as many as 600,000 souls across the realm through exposure, dearth, and the famines that stalked the thaw. Twilight descended prematurely that evening, the sun yielding too soon to the encroaching pall, as if drained by the effort to traverse the leaden vault. By the slant of mid-afternoon, daylight had ebbed to a bruised indigo, and the powdering over meadows and pastures caught the fading gleam, radiating an ethereal pall. Silhouettes elongated into spindly specters across the terrain, and a pall of anticipation cloaked the rural expanse, not serene, but charged, as if colossal, unseen forces stirred in the firmament overhead. Within the low-beamed interiors of homes, clans drew nearer to the glowing embers, flames cavorting over uneven daub and wattle, casting capering silhouettes that evoked restless spirits on the walls. The acrid haze of burning timber saturated every fiber, tresses, garments, the ambient ether, clinging like an insistent fog. At intervals, a figure would stir to coax fresh fuel into the blaze, attuned to the sizzle of evaporating dampness yielding to crackling ignition. Yet, despite the blaze's fervor, the freeze infiltrated relentlessly, slithering via fissures in thresholds and casements, snaking along flagstones to render the atmosphere brittle enough to rasp the throat on fuller inhalations. The youngest were cocooned in layered remnants of fabric, thread-worn mantles, faded kerchiefs, whatever tatters could defy the intrusion.
Matriarchs inspected tiny extremities, massaging warmth back into chilled digits to stave off the pallor of frostnip, a vigilance born of whispers for elders about limbs lost to the merciless grip. Beyond the clustered abodes stretched an expansive muted splendor, bathed in a ghostly argent sheen. Luna climbed, stark and full, her luminescence transforming the drifts into a mosaic of sparkling facets, akin to a jeweler's scatter of uncut gems. Auditory intrusions were scant and spectral, the low lament of rime thickening on cisterns, the remote snap of boughs fracturing beneath crystalline burdens, tales abound of ancient groves splintering like cannon fire in the night. In remote hollows, a lone canine's yelp might fracture the void, only to dissolve back into oblivion. This nocturnal vigil encapsulated the frost's dominion, a prelude to the broader cataclysm. Harbors like Amsterdam's canals ground to stasis under ice thick enough for wagons, the upper Adriatic's shallows in Venice hosting impromptu revels on skates amid the peril, and even the storied Thames hosting fleeting fares before the remorseless advance turned merriment to mourning. As the continent slumbered uneasily, the great ordeal deepened its hold. The hours of darkness dragged like a dying breath. Minutes thickened into something heavier than time itself, as though the night had been poured into the same iron mold that now held the rivers captive. In the low glow of the hearth, families kept an uneasy watch. One sleeper roused another. A hand reached for the dwindling stack of logs. Ears strained against the unnatural quiet that pressed from every side. How long could wood last? How long could flesh last? No one spoke the questions aloud, but they hovered in the smoke. When the first pallid light finally returned, it revealed windows transformed into walls of filigree ice, delicate fern-like crystals so dense that daylight entered only as a faint pearl glow.
A blade had to be heated over the fire before it could carve a peephole to the outside. What it revealed stole the breath anew. The land had grown paler, more hostile, as if the frost were a living thing that fed overnight.
By the third morning, the waterways themselves capitulated. It began at the margins, a fragile skin of ice, no thicker than a communion wafer, advancing with the patience of a besieging army. Where moving water had flashed and murmured only days before, there now lay only treacherous stillness, a mirror that threw the weak sun back into the sky. Hour by hour, the mirror thickened. The Loire, the Rhine, the Po, even the mighty Seine, all surrendered beneath the lid that grew from glass to granite. In Paris, the river's heartbeat slowed, then ceased entirely. Barges lay immobilized, like toys a giant child had abandoned mid-play. Their hawser ropes fused to the quays in stiff, crystalline knots. The perpetual creak of hulls and the soft slap of current against stone were replaced by a hollow, cathedral-like silence. Children, braver or more foolish than their elders, were the first explorers. They inched forward on the new continent of ice, tapping with sticks, then shuffling, then running, shrieks of delight spiraling upward in white clouds. For one dizzy afternoon, the frozen Seine became the widest skating rink Europe had ever known. But the fishermen who depended on those waters did not laugh. They stood at the edge, staring down at the blurred shadows of their submerged nets, poles raised in useless anger against a surface that rang like iron beneath their blows. The smell of the fish markets, brine, weed, silver scales, faded day by day, replaced by the clean, merciless scent of snow. Commerce choked. Grain barges that should have fed cities for weeks sat marooned, their holds turning into frozen vaults. Merchants in Lyon, Cologne, and Bordeaux opened ledgers with trembling fingers and began the grim arithmetic of survival. How many mouths? How many sacks? How many weeks until spring, if spring ever came? At night, the rivers spoke in a new tongue. Deep bass groans rolled upward from unimaginable depths as the ice contracted, followed by sudden cracks like musket fire, echoing for miles. Sleepers bolted upright in the dark, hearts hammering, certain that the world itself was splitting along some ancient seam. Blankets were pulled higher, prayers muttered into the embers.
Then the wind arrived, an ally the frost had kept in reserve. It tore down from the Arctic across the plains of Russia and Poland, gathering speed and malice as it crossed the Baltic. When it struck Western Europe, it came as a living blade, slicing through every chink and crevice. The earlier stillness had been oppressive. This was torment in motion. Shutters clattered like bones in a box, chimney throats howled with demon voices, and the thatch on cottages lifted and slapped down again, as though the roofs themselves were trying to tear free and escape. On the roads, disaster multiplied. Iron tires split with explosive reports. Axle grease turned to tallow and locked wheels solid. Abandoned carts lined the highways like the wreckage of a routed army, half buried already under racing plumes of snow. Horses, those patient titans, faltered and fell to their knees, blood crusted where nostrils had split in the knife-sharp air. Travelers who had left home with market-day cheer now stumbled into villages half dead, faces encased in masks of ice where tears had frozen. Inside the cottages, the battle became intimate. Every breath was a small betrayal, exhaling precious warmth into a room that drank it greedily. Women and old men stuffed rags into every crack, hung blankets over doorways, laid mattresses against windows, anything to slow the invasion. Yet still the cold found a way, sliding under door sills like smoke, coiling around ankles, climbing legs until the entire body felt dipped in iron. The hearth, once the proud heart of the home, now seemed a pitiful candle guttering against the darkness outside. And still the sky gave no promise. Night after night it remained cloudless, star-drenched, mercilessly clear, an open window through which the cold poured without hindrance. Each dawn the rivers gleamed a fraction brighter, the snowdrifts stood a fraction higher, and the wind sharpened its edge 1 degree more. Europe had entered the white heart of the Great Frost, and there was no sign that the heart intended to beat again any time soon. The smoke grew denser, almost chewable, as every hearth demanded tribute without pause.
Logs hissed and burst, throwing sparks that died before they touched the floor, swallowed by air too cold to let anything live long. Outside, the wind rewrote the countryside. Snow that had rested in gentle swells now rose in pale, undulating curtains, racing low over the fields like specters fleeing an unseen hunter. Drifts climbed the cottage walls until doors were reduced to low tunnels that had to be dug out anew each dawn. Paths, lanes, even the ancient cart tracks that had served generations disappeared under a seamless desert of white. A man could leave his threshold at sunrise certain of the way to the next village, and by noon find himself circling his own chimney, lost in a world where every horizon looked identical, blinding, pitiless, absolute. The forests themselves turned hostile. Laden boughs, made brittle as spun sugar, exploded without warning. The noise, sharp, splintering cracks that rolled between the trunks, carried for miles. Hunters returning empty-handed spoke in low voices of nights when the woods sounded like continuous artillery, each detonation followed by the heavy thud of fallen limbs and the panicked scattering of deer already gaunt from hunger.
Yet inside the trembling cottages, life clung on with obstinate grace. In the unsteady dance of firelight, fathers sharpened scythe blades and mended harness by touch more than sight. Mothers coaxed thread through needle eyes grown clumsy with cold, and children invented quieter games beneath mountains of quilts, tales of summers so vivid they almost warmed the air. Fear was there, coiled tight beneath the ribs, but it walked hand in hand with a fiercer instinct. Not yet. Not tonight. One more log, one more hour, one more dawn. By the 5th day, the frost had begun to alter the very rhythm of existence. Movements grew deliberate. Voices dropped to murmurs, as though loud sound might offend the cold and invite worse. Beams in the walls groaned like old men turning in bed. The timber contracted with audible pops that startled sleepers bolt upright. Windows became opal slabs. The sun, when it appeared at all, arrived as a sickly coin pressed behind thick lace. Then the cellars betrayed their owners. Wine barrels, once the pride of prosperous households, detonated in the night. Oak staves split with reports like pistol shots, and the precious liquid gushed across flagstones only to congeal into dark, ruby glass before it reached the stairs. The scent that rose was cloying, fermented grapes and wet stone, a perfume of ruin that lingered for weeks. Wheels of Conte and Parmesan turned to marble. Axes replaced knives at the table. Milk left a moment too long in the pail, bloomed with ice crystals that burst the staves. Hams suspended from rafters became pendulums of stone. Saws were fetched to portion them. Water, the humble necessity, ascended to the status of miracle. Wells froze so deeply that the bucket descended into a sleeve of ice, and the rope, stiff as a hawser, had to be thawed over the fire before it would coil. Whatever water was wrested from the depths steamed like a spirit for a few precious minutes, then surrendered again to frost if a watchful eye blinked. Adaptation came in small, desperate inventions. Livestock were brought indoors, cows lowing softly in the inglenook, goats nibbling at the thatch. chickens nesting in the warming pan. The reek of stable and byre mingled with wood smoke and human sweat until every breath tasted of survival. Children earned their keep, tiny red-mittened sentinels feeding the fire, scraping frost flowers from the panes so a sliver of daylight could find its way in, ferrying armfuls of kindling that grew shorter with every passing day. A new etiquette emerged without discussion. Neighbors met at woodpiles or half-dug doorways and exchanged news in whispers. How many logs remained, whose cow had stopped giving milk, whether old Jeanette in the valley had been seen since Tuesday. Some spoke of sins and divine retribution. Others simply stared at the sky, willing clouds, any clouds, to gather and soften the glacial glare. No one said out loud what every heart suspected. This winter had forgotten its place in the order of things. In the cities, the crisis announced itself with queues that began hours before first light. Paris awoke to streets already filled with motionless figures, cloaks pulled tight, feet shuffling in place to coax blood into toes, breath rising in frail columns that vanished almost before they formed. Bakers' ovens, fed half rations of damp wood, yielded loaves as heavy as stones. The smell of fresh bread, once the heartbeat of every morning, grew fainter with each sunrise. By the close of that first week, the great frost was no longer weather. It was a presence, ancient, deliberate, and utterly indifferent, that had settled over the continent like a second sky. And beneath that sky, millions of small fires burned lower, millions of hearts beat a little faster, and Europe waited in the white hush for whatever mercy or judgment might come next. Bakers rose long before the reluctant dawn, faces blackened by smoke and eyes stinging from cold. The flour they wrestled from sacks had turned to stone overnight, great white boulders that had to be smashed with mallets and iron bars before it would pass through the sieve. Ovens, those faithful dragons of every village, sulked and coughed. The damp wood refused to blaze, and the heavy air smothered every flame. When loaves finally emerged, smaller, darker, with crusts like baked clay, they were seized without complaint. People tucked them inside coats, next to the skin, as though warmth might still be borrowed from a starving crust. Those near the end of the queue watched the last heel disappear, turned away wordlessly, and trudged home through the blue darkness with empty baskets swinging like pendulums of defeat. Markets themselves began to feel like graveyards. Fish stalls gaped empty, the boards still smelling faintly of the river that no longer moved. Butchers hacked at the final frozen haunches, sparks flying from the cleaver as iron struck ice instead of meat. Only the rich could afford the scraps now, and even they paid in gold that felt colder than the air. The old comforting riot of smells, warm dough, roasting chestnuts, spilled wine, wet wool, thinned to nothing. All that remained was the clean, surgical bite of frost, and beneath it, the faint iron reek of blood, long since frozen in the veins. Taverns still opened their doors, but laughter no longer crossed the threshold. Men and women sat shoulder to shoulder, speaking in the hushed tones once reserved for churches. How many sacks were left in the bishop's granary? Had anyone seen the miller since Tuesday? Someone swore the price of rye had doubled overnight. Another claimed a convoy of wagons lay buried on the road to Chartres. Coins changed hands under tables, cloth for a cup of barley, a silver candlestick for 3 smoked herrings. Each transaction accompanied by the soft click of desperation. In the smaller towns, the markets simply ceased to exist. Shutters stayed barred. Squares that once rang with haggling fell into a silence broken only by wind. Neighbors met instead in barns or church porches, pooling what little remained: a twist of salt, a handful of dried apples, half a wheel of cheese hard as oak.
The air inside these gatherings was thick with smoke, tallow, and the sour warmth of too many bodies breathing the same fear. At night, parents waited until the children's breathing slowed, then leaned close over the dying fire.
How many more days if they ate only once? Should they slaughter the laying hen now or pray for eggs that would never come? Some simply tighten their belts another notch and lay down on empty stomachs, listening to the wind worry the eaves like a dog that refuses to leave. Beyond the last cottage lamp, the forests had become another country entirely. Familiar paths vanished under drifts sculpted into strange wind-carved ridges. Every trunk wore armor of ice inches thick. Branches bowed like penitents beneath the weight until, without warning, they shattered. The sound was unmistakable. A sharp explosion followed by a sweeping crash that sent snow pluming upward in ghostly fountains. Hunters claimed the woods now fired salvos all night long, as if an invisible army marched among the trees. The scent of the forest had changed too. Resin turned glassy sharp, earth locked under a lid of iron, the faintest ghost of pine struggling beneath layers of rime. Moss hung in brittle beards. When touched, it crumbled like sugar left too long in the jar. Brooks that once sang over pebbles now lay mute, their voices stolen and replaced by a silence so complete it rang in the ears. Yet life still moved. Fresh prints stitched secret stories across the snow, the delicate stitching of deer, the sly pads of foxes, and, closer to the villages than anyone liked, the broad, purposeful tracks of wolves driven down from the highlands by a hunger sharper than the wind. At night, their chorus rose, long, sliding notes that began as grief and ended as threat, rolling over the frozen fields until dogs inside the cottages answered with frantic barking and children burrowed deeper under blankets. Some hunters swore the trees themselves were speaking. Sap, frozen in the heartwood, expanded, splitting trunks with slow, deliberate cracks that sounded almost like words in a language older than Latin. Icicles the length of lances hung from outcrops, chiming softly when the wind passed through them, a music both beautiful and merciless. And still, in stolen moments, the world could startle with its loveliness.
Dawn, sliding across a clearing, could set the snow alight with rose and pearl. A single shaft of sunlight striking an ice-coated birch turned the entire tree into a pillar of pale fire. Breath hung in the air like incense, and for one heartbeat the cold felt pure rather than cruel. But beauty offered no bread, no firewood, no promise that tomorrow would be less hungry than today. Europe stood locked inside a jewel whose facets grew sharper with every passing night, and the great frost tightened its embrace without the slightest hint of mercy. Those who still had strength to venture beyond the village thresholds walked the woods as though entering a cathedral built of silence. Every footstep rang too loudly on the crusted snow. Every breath hung like incense before the altar of winter. They gathered the fallen boughs, those that had shattered in the night like green wood on an anvil, dragging them home in sledges that creaked with the effort. A man might spend an entire morning for one armful of fuel and count himself fortunate.
Hunters moved in pairs now, never alone, their bows half drawn against shadows that sometimes resolved into gaunt wolves with eyes the color of sleet. When a rabbit or a single desperate pheasant fell to an arrow, the kill was carried back like a relic, blood steaming briefly before it froze into rubies on the snow. Inside the cottages, the second week brought a new language, the soft scrape of the knife dividing one potato into 8 paper-thin slices. The measured drip of milk thawed drop by drop over embers.
the whispered counting of beans as they were tipped from a clay jar that grew lighter every evening. Mothers developed a new artistry, bread so delicate it was almost translucent, broth stretched with melted snow until it tasted of little more than memory. Children learned to chew slowly, to make one square of hardened cheese last a full minute on the tongue, to pretend that the gnawing in their bellies was only the wind. Barter replaced money almost without anyone noticing the moment it happened.
A woman traded her wedding shawl for 3 turnips and did not cry until she was alone. An old man parted with the last of his pipe tobacco for a single hen that had stopped laying weeks before. The air in every house carried the same faint, comforting perfume. Smoke, damp wool, and the sweet, loamy breath of vegetables coaxed back to life over the fire. Children felt the change in their bones, even when words were kept from them. Their games grew smaller, played beneath blankets instead of in the yard. A doll might be fed imaginary crusts. Wooden soldiers marched on a battlefield drawn in soot on the hearthstones. Laughter still came, but it arrived like a rare bird, brief, startled, and quickly gone. By the 9th day, the rivers had completed their betrayal. The Seine, the Loire, the lesser streams that once stitched the countryside together now lay as wide, indifferent boulevards of ice. Where water had moved, only stillness reigned.
Fishermen knelt at holes no wider than a porthole, chipping with axes until their shoulders shook, coaxing up a gray, reluctant trickle that froze again almost before it touched the bucket. Their nets, great webs of hemp and hope, hung from rafters like the shrouds of drowned giants, too heavy with ice to lift. Yet the ice itself became a stage. Children escaped the dim cottages and inched onto the glassy plain, first tapping with sticks, then stepping, then running. They slid on knees and stomachs, shrieking with a joy that felt almost illicit amid so much want. Their tracks crisscrossed the rivers like the scribbles of angels. For a few bright hours, the frozen water belonged to them alone, a kingdom of laughter ringing clear and far through air that could cut flesh from bone. Adults watched from the banks, faces unreadable. Some saw only the danger, ice that could give way without warning, water black and swift beneath. Others saw something larger, proof that delight could still spark even when the world seemed determined to extinguish every light. A few old men were heard to say that children skating on the rivers in January was a thing not seen since the days of their grandfathers, and perhaps that meant the cold, for all its cruelty, was writing itself into legend. But legends do not fill bellies. When the short day bled out and the children were called home, their cheeks scarlet and their mittens soaked, the ice resumed its ancient, patient work. Night fell like a blade. The rivers gleamed harder under the moon. The snow creaked as it settled another finger's breadth. And somewhere in the darkness, a wolf lifted its muzzle to the stars and sang a long, mourning note that carried all the way to the trembling hearths of men. Europe was learning what it meant to live inside a miracle that might yet kill them, and still the frost showed no sign of loosening its grip. By the 11th day, the roads had vanished entirely, swallowed by a white silence that mocked every map and memory. What had once been a king's highway or a humble cart track was now only a shallow depression between towering drifts, a treacherous corridor that could rise to a man's chest in the space of 10 paces. Wheels were useless. Even sledges foundered. The few who still had to travel, messengers, priests, the desperate, moved on foot, roped together like mountaineers, probing the snow ahead with long ash poles lest they step into a drift that would close over their heads without a sound.
Grown men watched the children on the ice with complicated hearts. Part of them wanted to roar the little ones back to safety. Another part, quieter but stronger, understood that this bright, reckless play was the last pure thing left in a world turning gray with hunger. So they stood at the banks in silence, hands buried in patched coats, ready to run if the ice groaned too deeply, but unwilling to steal the 1 hour of ordinary childhood the frost had not yet taken. Along the rivers, the stranded barges looked like the ribs of dead beasts picked clean. Grain that should have fed Lyon or Rouen sat in frozen heaps under tarpaulins stiff as iron. Rats, too cold to thieve, died curled inside sacks, and the faint, sweet, sour reek of sprouting wheat drifted from splits in the canvas, a smell of promise already turning to waste. Dock workers who once cursed the slow current now stared at the motionless waterway and crossed themselves, knowing the city's next month of bread lay locked beneath a yard of ice no axe could conquer. Inside the cottages, the arithmetic of survival grew merciless. A family of 6 might own 1 small round of cheese the size of a cartwheel. The mother marked it with a knife into 36 slices, 1 for each person for 12 more days if no stranger knocked and asked for charity. Salt pork was pared so thin it was almost transparent. The fat was rendered twice, then the rinds boiled again for soup. When the last onion was grated into the pot, the cook wept without sound, tears freezing on her cheeks before they reached her chin. The animals suffered in plain sight now. Cattle stood in the yards like statues, ribs sharp beneath hide crusted white. Their breath rose in slow, deliberate clouds that turned to hoarfrost on their lashes and muzzles. Farmers broke the ice on water troughs a dozen times a day, hands cracked and bleeding because a cow that could not drink would not give milk, and a cow that gave no milk would soon be meat, if there were strength left to butcher it. Hens sat hunched and motionless, combs pale as wax. Children carried the warmest ones inside at night, cradling them against their own thin chests so the birds might lay 1 more egg before the cold claimed them too. At dusk, the wolves grew bolder. Their tracks ringed the villages now, neat, purposeful prints that ended at garden gates and barn doors. One shepherd in the Auvergne lost 3 sheep in a single night, only smears of blood and dragged wool to show where the pack had struck. After that, men took to sitting up with loaded muskets across their knees, dozing in shifts while the fire burned low and the wind prowled the eaves like a living thing. Yet even on the 11th day, there were glimpses of something fiercer than despair. A boy in Normandy found a clutch of frost-bitten sparrows beneath the eaves and warmed them inside his shirt until their hearts beat again. An old woman in Bavaria divided her last cup of barley between her neighbor's children and her own, saying only, "We will all be hungry together or not at all." In 100 darkened rooms, hands reached across tables to squeeze other hands, brief, wordless covenants that the frost might take their strength but not their kindness. Outside, the roads lay buried, the rivers lay mute, the forests cracked like gunfire in the night. Europe moved through its days with the slow, deliberate care of a man walking across thin ice he knows may not hold. Each sunrise revealed a world a little whiter, a little harder, a little more beautiful in its cruelty. And still no cloud appeared to soften the iron sky. The great frost of 1709 was only beginning to teach the continent what endurance truly meant. By the 12th day, the roads had become myths, faint hollows in the snow that the wind erased before anyone could follow them. A carriage, abandoned a week earlier, might lie half a mile from the highway, half buried, its varnish split, and wheels exploded outward like frozen flowers. Horses, that once trotted proudly to market,
now stumbled on legs splayed wide, iron shoes skidding on ice hidden beneath powder, sparks spitting blue-white with every desperate step. Their drivers walked ahead, probing with staffs, faces wrapped in scarves that froze solid and had to be cracked away from skin when they finally halted for the night. Post riders, those stubborn few still attempting the king's mail, moved like ghosts. A man might leave Paris at dawn with dispatches tied beneath 3 layers of oilskin and arrive in Orléans 4 days later, beard solid ice, eyelashes glued shut, ink in his saddle flask turned to black gravel.
Letters reached families weeks late, pages brittle as dead leaves, words sometimes blurred where tears had frozen and thawed again. A wife waiting for news of a soldier son learned to listen for the crunch of snow under boots that might never come. Isolation settled over the land like another layer of rime. Villages that lay a morning's walk apart now felt as distant as the moon. Rumor became currency. Someone claimed to have seen smoke rising from the next valley 3 days ago. Another swore a peddler had passed through with 2 sacks of chestnuts and a tale that the cold was already easing in Spain. No one quite believed, yet everyone repeated the stories, because hope, like bread, had to be stretched. Inside the cottages, the world shrank to the circle of firelight. Conversation turned inward. How many more mornings if the children ate only half a bowl of gruel? Could the goat be kept alive another week on beet tops and straw? Relatives in distant cities ceased to be spoken of as living people and became instead prayers whispered into the embers. On the 12th morning, the markets, those few that still opened, looked like altars to scarcity. A baker set out 8 small loaves on a board. The line formed before the church bell finished its single cracked note. The bread was dark, dense, and cold to the core. People broke it against the edge of the table because teeth alone could not. A woman traded her dead mother's silver thimble for 3 potatoes and walked home cradling them inside her bodice so they would not freeze before nightfall. In the square at Rouen, 2 men came to blows over the last half-pound of salt pork. The fight was slow, almost ceremonial. Clumsy swings of numbed arms, breath exploding in white clouds, until neighbors pulled them apart and divided the meat with a hatchet, 4 ounces each, no one trusting anyone to carry the whole piece home. Afterwards, the combatants sat side by side on a bench, sharing a pipe in silence, too exhausted for shame. Children learned new lessons without being told. They no longer asked for seconds. They carried kindling in arms too thin for the load and stacked it with solemn care. When a dog whined at the door, they hushed it quickly, afraid the noise would wake the cold that waited outside like a patient creditor. Even the animals seemed to understand rationing. A milking cow would stand patiently while the farmer scraped frost from the pail, then lick the ice from his cracked fingers as if in gratitude for the few mouthfuls of warm mash he could spare. Hens pecked once or twice at scattered grain and then simply waited, feathers fluffed into pitiful spheres, eyes half closed against the wind. At night, the tension found its voice. A baby cried longer than usual, and the mother rocked it with one hand while the other counted the remaining turnips in the dark. Somewhere a door slammed, somewhere else a woman began singing a lullaby that broke halfway through because there was no strength left for the high notes. Yet, even on the 12th day, the old reflexes held. A neighbor knocked with a cup of hot water thickened with barley. Another arrived carrying a single candle stub because your window looked darker than mine. Hands still reached out in the gloom, brief touches on sleeves or shoulders that said, without words, "We are not finished yet." Outside, the snow kept falling, not in storms now, but in a slow, deliberate sift, as though the sky itself were rationing flakes. The world grew whiter, quieter, more beautiful, and more dangerous with every hour. And beneath the iron sky, Europe measured its life one careful heartbeat at a time, waiting for a thaw that no one any longer truly expected. By the 14th day, the frost no longer contented itself with stillness. It declared open war. It began just after noon when the sky, which had been a merciless, cloudless blue for weeks, suddenly sagged and turned the color of old pewter. The light flattened, as though someone had drawn a lid over the world. The first flakes came almost gently, tiny, perfect stars that melted on contact with a child's mitten. People paused in doorways and looked up with something close to gratitude. Snow meant clouds, and clouds meant insulation, perhaps even a softening of the murderous cold. Gratitude lasted less than an hour. The wind arrived from the northeast with the voice of an invading army. It tore across the North Sea, gathered speed over the frozen Baltic, and struck the continent like a mailed fist. Flakes thickened from lace to gravel, driving horizontally, stinging any scrap of exposed skin until it burned scarlet. Shutters that had rattled for weeks now screamed on their hinges. Thatch lifted in great shuddering breaths before slapping back down. Chimneys, proud stone throats that had never once yielded, coughed and roared as the gale forced its way down them, scattering embers across hearths and filling rooms with blinding smoke. Outside, the world vanished. Villages disappeared behind a moving wall of white. A man could not see his own outstretched hand, let alone the next cottage. Snow did not fall so much as hurl itself, piling into drifts that rose a foot in minutes. Doors that opened inward were buried in the space of a single psalm. Those that opened outward became tombs, sealing families inside with the corpse of their fire. In the byres, cattle moaned and pressed against one another, eyes rolling white with terror. Horses kicked at stable walls until their hooves bled. Wolves, driven beyond caution, tried to force their way into barns, hurling themselves against doors until the timber groaned. One farmer in the Ardennes found claw marks a hand's breadth deep in the oak the next morning, and the prints of 3 full-grown animals circling the threshold like a nightmare drawn in the snow. Travel ceased entirely. Anyone caught between settlements simply lay down where he stood and was covered within minutes. Shepherds later spoke of finding the bodies in spring, kneeling, heads bowed, hands still clutching staffs, as though the dead had tried to pray the storm away and been answered with burial. Inside the cottages, the battle became intimate and brutal. Snow sifted through every crack, forming delicate ridges on windowsills and tables. Fires shrank to sullen red eyes, starved of air by the pressure of the wind. People fed them their last chairs, their spare looms, the cradles their children had outgrown. Mothers wrapped infants against their own bodies and lay on the floor in front of the hearth, forming living breakwaters so the gale would not steal the last ember. Children stopped asking questions. They simply clung, small animals seeking warmth, and learned the new sound of adult fear. The quick, shallow breathing that meant Mother was counting how many more sticks of kindling lay in the box and discovering the answer was not enough. And still the storm screamed on. All night the wind spoke in a voice older than churches, older than kings. It tore tiles from roofs, snapped ancient oaks like kindling, drove snow through keyholes in needle-fine jets that stung the face like hot sand. Families who had measured survival in days now measured it in hours. How long until the roof beams cracked? How long until the oil ran out? How long until the animals began to die in earnest? By dawn on the 15th day, the wind dropped as suddenly as it had risen. An unearthly hush returned, deeper now because the land itself lay stunned. People dug upward through tunnels of snow to reach their own front doors. When they finally broke through, they found a landscape flayed clean. Drifts stood higher than houses.
Familiar landmarks were gentle white hillocks hiding stone walls or frozen corpses. The sky above was pale and innocent, as though it had never birthed monsters. The Great Frost of 1709 had revealed its true face. Not merely cold, but an elemental fury determined to test whether anything, human, animal, or hope itself, could survive its full attention. Europe drew a shuddering breath, looked upon the new, merciless world the storm had sculpted, and began, slowly, painfully, and without any promise of success, to dig itself out. By the 15th day, the storm had spent its first rage, but it left behind a landscape so altered that people stepped outside and felt they had awakened on another planet. Snow stood in smooth, sculpted waves higher than a man on horseback. Cottages looked like ships half sunk in a white sea. Only the smoke rising from chimneys proved anyone still lived inside. Roofs sagged dangerously. In the night, one heard the slow, tortured groan of beams bearing more weight than any builder had ever imagined. From time to time, a whole roof load slid off in a single avalanche, the crash muffled by the snow, yet still loud enough to jolt sleepers upright with hearts hammering. Those who had to go out, to reach the well, to break a breathing hole for the cattle, to dig a path to the woodpile, moved like divers in deep water. Each step required a lifting of the knee almost to the chest. Each footfall punched through the crusted surface and sank to the thigh. A journey of 20 paces could cost a quarter hour and leave a grown man trembling with exhaustion. Many simply tied a rope around the waist and fastened the other end to the doorpost, the way sailors lashed themselves to the mast in a hurricane.
The roads were archaeological relics. A tall drift might hide a mail coach complete with horses frozen mid-stride. Only a corner of painted wood or the brass of a harness bell betrayed its grave. Farmers who once judged distance by church spires now navigated by instinct and prayer. A man setting out to check on an elderly neighbor might find the cottage by stumbling against its buried wall, then spend an hour scraping snow from the door with bare hands because the shovel had been left inside. Inside, the fire was no longer comfort. It was government, religion, and medicine in one. Families formed a silent rotation. One fed the flames, one melted snow for water, one rubbed circulation back into a child's blue feet. One counted the remaining logs and tried not to let the others see the fear in the reckoning. Bread was sliced so thin it was nearly transparent. The knife scraped the board with a dry, desperate sound. A single potato might be grated raw into gruel so that the illusion of volume could quiet a child's crying a little longer.
Animals hovered on the edge of surrender. Cows stood motionless hour after hour, heads lowered, flanks hollow. Farmers brought the weakest beasts into the living room itself, the stink of manure and warm milk mingling with wood smoke until the air was almost too thick to breathe. Hens were carried in aprons and set beside the hearth like honored guests. Their combs, once proud and red, had turned the color of candle wax. A wise woman in Brittany kept her milking goat on the bed beside her, the animal's yellow eyes reflecting the flames while it chewed slowly on a child's discarded stocking. News arrived in the form of half-frozen apparitions, a peddler who had lost 3 fingers to the cold, a priest who had buried 2 parishioners found kneeling in the snow, a boy sent from the next valley with a message tied under his shirt, the ink frozen into purple crystals that had to be thawed before the words could be read. Each visitor was given the warmest corner and the last cup of hot water, because hospitality
was one of the few things the frost had not yet managed to freeze out of human hearts.
At night, the temperature sank lower than any living person could remember. Wells froze so hard that the iron crank rang like a bell when struck. Milk left an instant too far from the fire formed a skin of ice thick enough to bear the weight of a spoon. Breath froze on beards and prickly masks. Eyelashes stuck together and had to be pried apart with careful fingers. Sleep became dangerous. More than one old man closed his eyes beside the fire and simply never opened them again. Yet even on the 15th day, there were moments that caught the breath for reasons other than cold. When a shaft of sunlight finally broke through the low gray lid, the snow blazed so fiercely that eyes watered from sheer brilliance. Icicles along the eaves grew into forests of crystal spears, chiming softly when the wind touched them. A child pressed her face to the one clear patch on the window and laughed, a small, startled sound, at the sight of a fox crossing the yard on snowshoes of its own fur, red coat ablaze against the white.
The fire burned lower. The woodpile shrank to a handful of sticks. The last onion was grated into the pot, and the pot itself was half filled with snow to make the broth go further. Still the hearth glowed, small, defiant, alive. Around it, families sat shoulder to shoulder, sharing the thin warmth of bodies and the thick warmth of something less tangible. The knowledge that they were, for this one more night, not yet defeated. Outside, Europe lay buried under a silence so complete it seemed the world had forgotten how to speak. Inside, a single log crackled, a single heart beat on, and the great frost of 1709 weighed its next move. By the 17th day, the frost had begun to write its name directly on human flesh. It started innocently enough, a toe that refused to warm even when pressed against a sibling's belly under the blankets, a patch of cheek that stayed white long after coming inside. Then came the dull, gnawing ache that no fire could reach, followed by the sharper sting when blood tried to return. Chilblains bloomed on knuckles and earlobes, angry red swellings that itched and burned in the same breath. Children learned a new game, counting the purple blotches on one another's faces like medals won in a war no one had chosen. Coughs appeared overnight, dry at first, then deeper, rattling in narrow chests. The air in the cottages, kept sealed against the cold, grew thick and stale despite the smoke that leaked from every crack. Breathing itself became a small labor. Grandmothers rummaged in mouse-chewed chests for the last sprigs of thyme or sage, steeping them in snow water until the liquid turned the color of weak tea and tasted of earth and desperation. Every swallow was rationed as carefully as bread. Outside, the world had taken on the quality of a dream remembered after waking. Rivers lay so still they seemed painted rather than frozen. Yet every fisherman knew the truth. Beneath the iron lid, the water still moved, black and lethal. Men crept out at dawn, wrapped in whatever cloth could be spared, faces swaddled until only their eyes showed, eyes rimmed red from wind and smoke. They lay belly down on the ice, ear pressed to the hole they had chipped, listening for the faint thump of a pike or carp nosing the undersurface. When a line finally jerked, the triumph was fierce but brief. A single fish to feed 8 mouths, its silver sides already stiffening in the air before it reached the pan. Hands were the worst casualties. Fingers thickened like sausages, split along the creases, wept clear fluid that froze into glittering scales. A man could haul a bucket from the river and find the skin of his palm stuck to the iron handle when he tried to let go. Women learned to wrap door latches with rags before touching them. Children were forbidden to lick the pump handle no matter how thirsty they grew. At night, the pain found its voice. Someone always woke sobbing, quiet, choked sounds so as not to disturb the others, rocking a foot or hand that felt packed in hot coals. Mothers kept a kettle simmering with a scrap of wool inside. When the cries began, they fished out the steaming cloth and wrapped the ruined limb until the child drifted back into exhausted sleep. Frostbite claimed its first pieces of people that week. A boy in Flanders lost 3 toes, black shriveled things that came away in his father's trembling hand like dead leaves. An old woman near Toulouse never felt the tips of her ears drop off. She only noticed when blood spotted the pillow and the pain suddenly stopped. The priest who came to shrive her found her sitting upright by the fire, calmly knitting with what fingers remained, as though nothing remarkable had happened. Yet even on the 17th day, life refused to surrender entirely. A girl in Normandy discovered that if she sang softly while rubbing her brother's frozen feet, the pain seemed to ease a fraction. Fishermen on the Loire formed a chain across the ice, passing buckets hand to hand so no single person had to stand too long in the wind. In a village near Cologne, a baker who had run out of flour mixed sawdust and dried apple peel with his last handful of rye. The loaves tasted of forest and autumn, and the children ate them without complaint. The hearth fires burned lower, the wood piles dwindled to kindling, and the sky remained a pitiless, cloudless blue that poured cold downward like molten metal. But inside the circle of flickering light, hands still reached for other hands. Breath still rose in fragile clouds that carried lullabies, prayers, and the stubborn, whispered promise that tomorrow they would try again. The great frost kept its grip, and Europe, scarred, limping, half-frozen, kept its heart beating in the dark. By the 19th day, the frost had slipped inside people's thoughts as easily as it slid through keyholes. It lived in the pause before a mother cut the last rye loaf. How thin could the slice be before it became nothing at all? It sat on every chest when the wind rose at dusk, pressing breath shallow. It walked the floorboards at 3 a.m., counting with the sleeper how many sticks of kindling remained before the darkness would have to be faced without fire.
Conversation itself grew careful. A question too direct. How much grain is left in the loft? Could crack the thin ice of calm everyone skated upon. Instead, people spoke in half sentences and glances. The tilt of a head toward the near-empty sack, the slow shake of a father's beard when a child asked for a second helping. Even laughter, when it came, arrived apologetically, as though ashamed of taking up warmth that could have gone to a coughing grandparent. Children learned the new grammar of silence. They no longer ran. They placed each foot with the concentration of tightrope walkers. They asked no more, "When will it thaw?" because the question itself had become dangerous. Instead, they watched adult faces the way sailors watch the sky, reading weather in a tightened mouth, or the way a hand lingered too long over the woodpile. At night, the cottage walls seemed to breathe inward. Beams groaned like old men turning in bed. Frost flowers spread across windows until the glass became opaque, blind.
Families lay spooned together for warmth, listening to one another's hearts, because the sound was proof that the cold had not yet won everything. When a child whimpered in sleep, a parent's hand found the small back without waking, tracing slow circles, the way one might calm a frightened animal. Outside, the world had achieved a terrible perfection. Snow lay so deep and undisturbed that moonlight on it was almost blinding. The rivers reflected starlight like polished steel.
Wolves no longer bothered to hide their paths. Their tracks crossed yards and paused at doorsteps as if measuring how much longer the thin wooden barriers could hold. Yet even on the 19th day, small, stubborn refusals flared. A woman in Provence used her wedding linen to strain the last flower, then folded the cloth with the same reverence she had once used on her bridal morning. An old soldier in Bavaria taught the village boys to chew pine needles for the faint sweetness and the vitamin that kept gums from bleeding.
In a hamlet near Bruges, the priest melted the lead from a broken church window to trade for a single sack of barley, telling the wide-eyed children that God would understand the loan. Inside one cottage, a grandmother who had not spoken aloud in 3 days suddenly began to sing, an old cradle song from a summer so distant it felt like legend. Her voice was thin, cracked, barely louder than the fire. But every person in the room stopped moving and let the notes settle over them like a blanket warmer than wool. The frost took no notice. It kept thickening the ice on the buckets, blackening another row of potatoes in the cellar, stealing another degree from the night. But for the length of that one song, the people inside the small circle of firelight remembered a time when winter ended, when rivers ran, when children woke hungry only for breakfast, not for tomorrow itself. When the last note died, the silence was not heavier, it was shared. Hands found other hands in the dark. Someone fed the fire one more carefully counted stick.
Outside, the 19th night of the Great Frost of 1709 settled its full weight upon Europe. Inside, 8 hearts beat on, slow and deliberate, refusing, for one more hour, one more minute, to surrender the rhythm they had been born to. By the 20th day, the fire had become something closer to a god than a convenience. Wood was no longer counted in armloads, it was counted in hours of life. A single split log might be weighed in the hand like gold before being laid on the embers, and the person who placed it there felt the eyes of the entire household follow the motion. Furniture disappeared piece by piece. First, the broken stool, then the old cradle no longer needed. Finally, the carved marriage chest that had stood at the foot of the bed for 40 years. Each splinter driven into the flames carried a small, silent mourning. People moved through the villages like slow ghosts. A man setting out for the woodpile tied a rope from door to shed the way alpine travelers rope themselves to one another, because a whiteout could rise in minutes and erase the world.
Children were posted at windows with the solemn duty of shouting if they saw a neighbor's silhouette stagger or fall. More than one life was saved by a child's high, clear call cutting through the wind. Inside, the air itself seemed to thicken with smoke and the sweet rot smell of burning applewood from someone's orchard bench. Eyes watered constantly, lungs adapted to a permanent rasp. Families sat almost on top of the hearth, knees touching knees, backs curved like petals around the glow. When a log collapsed into crimson coals, the small avalanche of sparks felt like applause for having made it one more hour. Meals became rituals performed in the fire's direct light. A single potato, black from frost, was held in the flames on the end of a knife until the skin split and the flesh steamed. It was then divided with the gravity of communion, the smallest child first, the sick second, the adults last, and often not at all. A cup of hot water colored with a rind of dried apple passed from hand to hand like a chalice.
No one spoke while it circulated. The only sound was the soft pop of burning resin and the wind prowling the roof like a creditor who already knew he would be paid. Ingenuity grew in the dark. A cooper in Normandy dismantled his best barrels and burned the staves, weeping as he did it because the smell of seasoned oak reminded him of wine and festivals. A widow near Vienna discovered that the rushes frozen in the village pond burned slowly if twisted tight. She and her daughter spent an entire afternoon on their knees harvesting them, returning home with fingers too numb to feel the splinters. Books were sacrificed. prayer books first, because the families agreed God would understand. Then the few cherished volumes of stories read aloud in better years. Pages curled and blackened, releasing a faint, papery perfume that made the children cry for reasons they could not name. At night, the fire was never allowed to die completely. A chosen watcher sat wrapped in every spare blanket, feeding the coals finger-thin sticks at measured intervals, eyes fixed on the glow the way sailors once watched the pole star.
If the watcher dozed and the flames sank too low, someone always woke. Some inner alarm older than memory, and the chain of hands passed another precious splinter to the fire before the cold could rush in and claim the room. Outside, the 20th night pressed down with a clarity so perfect it felt cruel. The moon turned the snowfields into a desert of silver. Every breath hung in the air like a small ghost before it vanished. Somewhere a wolf tested the ice on a village pond, and the crack carried for miles, a single gunshot in the silence. Inside one cottage, a grandmother who had not left her corner in a week lifted her head and spoke for the first time in days. Her voice was barely louder than the fire, yet every person heard it. 20 nights, she said. 20 mornings we have stolen back from it. That is 20 more than some. No one answered. There was no need. A child shifted closer to the warmth of an older sibling. Someone laid the very last chair rung across the coals.
The flames took it greedily, flared high for a moment, and painted the cracked walls with moving gold. Outside, the great frost of 1709 kept its ancient vigil. Inside, the small, fierce heart of the fire beat on, and 8 souls breathed with it, counting the night in sparks and heartbeats, refusing to yield the 21st dawn without a fight. By the 22nd day, the livestock had begun to die in earnest. It happened quietly, the way everything now happened. A cow that had stood all night with her head lowered simply folded her knees at dawn and lay down in the straw as though for a rest, and never rose again. A clutch of hens found stiff beneath the roost, their eyes filmed with frost, combs black as burnt paper. A goat kid born too late in the year bleated once, a thin sound like a breaking reed, then went still in its mother's side. Farmers greeted each morning with the same dread. How many would they carry out this time? The frozen carcasses were dragged into the yard because no one had strength to bury them in iron-hard earth.
There they lay in a tidy, terrible row, already half covered by the next fall of snow, until wolves or foxes came in the night and argued over what the frost had begun. The living animals moved like shadows of themselves. Cows gave barely a cup of milk, thin and bluish, that froze in the pail before it reached the house. Horses stood splay-legged over their feed boxes, ribs sharp as washboards, staring at the handful of moldy hay as if trying to remember what to do with it. When a farmer laid a hand on a flank, he felt only bones and the faint, frantic flutter of a heart working too hard for too little blood. Children were no longer sent to the barns alone. The cold there could kill faster than any wolf. Instead, they carried warm stones wrapped in rags to lay against the cows' bellies, or sat among the hens with the weakest birds tucked inside their coats, trying to coax warmth from their own small bodies.
They learned to recognize the signs. The cow that no longer bothered to turn her head when spoken to. The horse whose breath came shallow and fast. The hen that closed her eyes and let her neck go limp against a child's chest. The smell in the byres had changed. No longer the honest reek of manure and warm beasts. Now it carried the sweet, sour tang of starvation, and the faint, coppery note of death held at bay. Straw that had once been golden was trampled into black muck and frozen solid. Every morning it had to be chipped away with an axe before fresh could be laid. When a bucket of water was poured into a trough, it rang like a bell, then filmed over with ice almost before the echo died. Yet people still rose in the dark, still wrapped their cracked hands, still measured out the last forkfuls of hay as carefully as if it were gold dust. They spoke to the animals the way they once spoke to children, soft, encouraging nonsense, because silence felt too much like surrender. A farmer in Poitou was seen kissing his old mare between the eyes before leading her to the place where the weakest were shot to save hay for the rest. He apologized aloud as he pulled the trigger, and the sound carried clear across the frozen fields. Inside the cottages, the milk pail came back lighter every day. The evening broth grew clearer, the portion of bread thinner. Mothers began mixing acorn flour with the last rye, and the children learned not to complain about the bitterness. When a goat finally lay down and would not rise, the family killed it in the kitchen because the yard was too cold for blood to flow. They wept without sound while the pot filled, and the smell of cooking meat, the first real meat in weeks, filled the room like an accusation. At night, the wind prowled the barns the way it prowled the houses. Doors rattled on leather hinges. Somewhere, a chain clinked as a horse shifted its weight one last time. Families lay awake, listening for the next thud of a body hitting frozen ground, counting heartbeats, human and animal, the way misers count coins. By the 22nd day, the great frost had taken the rivers, the roads, the crops, the firewood, and now it was taking the last of the livestock, link by link, the way a patient hunter pulls in a net. And still, in the thin gray before dawn, a farmer somewhere opened the barn door with fingers that would never bend properly again, spoke gently to the few beasts that answered with a faint huff of cloudy breath, and began the slow, sacred work of keeping life alive for one more day. By the 24th day, the world had become a single, perfect crystal, and every step risked shattering it. The snow no longer fell, it simply existed, deep, weightless, and treacherous. A meadow that had once fed a village now looked like an untouched sea, its surface sculpted into long, wind-polished waves that caught the low sun and flung it back in blinding flashes. Beauty had turned predator. Drifts hid crevasses where a man could vanish to the waist or the neck. Ice masked air pockets that rang hollow beneath a boot and then gave way without warning.
Children were forbidden to play outside at all. A single game of tag could end with a small body swallowed so completely that only the echo of a scream marked the place. Hunters moved like penitents. They went out roped together, faces wrapped until only a slit for the eyes remained, each foot tested twice before weight was committed. A rifle shot was rarely heard now. Powder froze in the pans, and the report would have carried too far anyway, telling every starving wolf within miles exactly where warm blood still walked. Instead, they set snares of twine and hope, checked them at dawn with hearts loud in their throats, and considered a single half-frozen hare reason to whisper thanks to saints no one had remembered to pray to in weeks. Fishing had become a form of meditation. Men lay flat on the ice for hours, cheek pressed to the hole they had nursed open with a heated stone, feeling for the faint tug that meant life beneath the lid of death. When a perch or bleak finally rose, pale and sluggish, it was lifted out as gently as a newborn, because to drop it meant watching it freeze solid before it touched the snow.
The fish was carried home inside the hunter's coat, against his own skin, so that the last of its body heat might mingle with his own. Foraging parties, mostly women and older children, crawled on hands and knees along south-facing banks where the snow was thinnest, scraping with knives for the buried crowns of nettles or the swollen roots of burdock. They chewed pine cambium as they worked, the sharp resin taste keeping gums from bleeding. A handful of rose hips, hard as pebbles and furred with ice, was treasure enough to justify frostbitten fingers. They returned at dusk, bent almost double under pathetic bundles, singing softly under their breath so the cold would not hear them and take offense. Inside the cottages, the air had grown sacred with scarcity. A single small fish fed 6. Its bones were boiled twice, then cracked for the marrow, then boiled again until the water itself was counted as broth. Children learned to swallow without chewing, to make one bite occupy the mouth for minutes. When a snare yielded nothing for 3 days running, a family simply looked at one another across the hearth and tightened their belts another notch without a word. Complaint had become a luxury no one could afford. Yet even on the 24th day, beauty ambushed them. At dawn, the sun rose red and thin, striking the snowfields until the entire world blazed rose and gold. For one breathless minute, every drift burned with silent fire. Every icicle became a prism, and the breath of the few souls who witnessed it hung in the air like 1,000 tiny rainbows. A woman carrying water from the river stopped, bucket forgotten, and wept without sound because the sight hurt with a sweetness sharper than hunger. A boy who had not smiled in weeks laughed once, a small cracked sound when the light caught a single snowflake on his mitten and turned it into a star. The moment passed. The sun climbed higher, the color drained to the usual iron white, and the deadly crystal landscape reasserted itself. But they carried the memory inside with them, the way they carried the last ember to the next fire, carefully, reverently, proof that something in the world still knew how to be kind, even if only for the length of a held breath. Outside, the great frost of 1709 waited, patient as geology. Inside, a dozen small fires, fed by furniture, hope, and the occasional miracle, glowed against the dark, and Europe measured its life in heartbeats and sparks, refusing to believe that 24 days was the final count. By the 25th day, the frost no longer asked permission. It simply took what it wanted. It began before first light with a stillness so complete that people woke in their beds thinking the world had ended in the night. Then the clouds rolled in from the northeast, low and bruise-colored, and the first flakes fell, large, slow, almost tender. For an hour, the villages looked like the inside of a shaken snow globe. Roofs softened, harsh angles blurred, the world made gentle for the first time in weeks.
The gentleness lasted exactly as long as a child's delighted gasp. After that, the wind arrived, not gusting, but steady, deliberate, murderous. It took the falling snow and turned it into a moving wall of white knives. Visibility shrank to the length of an arm. A man opening his door to check the barn found himself facing a solid sheet of driving ice that drove him backward into the room, as though an invisible hand had shoved him. Doors that had stood for centuries slammed shut on their own. Shutters tore from hinges and sailed off like pale birds. Inside, the cottages became caves,
Snow sifted through every crack, forming perfect miniature drifts on windowsills and tabletops. Fires sulked, choked by the pressure of the gale roaring down chimneys. Families dragged mattresses and livestock into the single warmest room, built a fortress of bodies and blankets around the hearth, and fed the flames with whatever still had a shape that would burn. The smell was no longer comforting wood smoke. It was acrid, desperate, green timber, old chair rails, a child's wooden horse.
Outside, the world disappeared. A person standing in his own yard could not see the barn 10 paces away. Horses screamed in their stalls, a high, panic sound that carried even through the roar. Cattle pressed against one another until the weakest were crushed or smothered. Somewhere a church bell began to toll of its own accord as the wind worried the rope. A slow, mournful note that went on until the bell cracked in the cold and fell silent forever. Travel became suicide. A party of 3 men who tried to reach a neighboring hamlet for salt simply vanished. Weeks later, their bodies were found seated back to back in a circle. Cloaks frozen stiff as boards, faces turned toward a sky they could no longer see. A courier on the Paris-Lyon road was discovered in spring still upright on his horse, both of them half buried, the man's hand frozen to the reins and his last letter clutched against his chest like a playing card. Inside the sealed rooms, the storm spoke a new language.
It clawed at the roof tiles, hissed through keyholes, found every weak join, and punished it. Icicles that had hung like glass spears grew thicker, heavier, until they tore away in great crashing blades that could shear a man in half. The temperature inside the cottages, kept alive by sheer will and the last of the furniture, fell so low that breath froze on lips and eyelashes. Children were dressed in every stitch the family owned and still shivered so hard their teeth rattled like dice in a cup. Time lost meaning. There was no day, only a gray-white roaring dark that pressed against the walls. The only clock was the fire. When the flames sank to sullen coals, another precious log was fed in, and the household counted one more hour bought from death. At night, the wind reached a pitch that felt personal, as though the storm itself hated the small pockets of warmth and was determined to snuff them out. Mothers sang lullabies they no longer believed in. Fathers told stories of summers that felt like lies.
When a roof beam finally cracked, sharp as a musket shot, the entire family held its breath until the roof held. Somewhere else, another roof did not hold. No one heard it fall. Yet even on the 25th day, in the heart of the fury, the old reflexes persisted. A woman in Flanders used her wedding dress to block a broken shutter. A boy in Swabia kept the fire alive by burning his school primer page by page, reading each aloud before committing it to the flames so the knowledge would not be entirely lost. An old priest in the Alps carried the Blessed Sacrament from house to house through drifts chest high because people begged for absolution before what might be the last night. And in one cottage near Rouen, a grandmother who had been silent for days suddenly laughed, a small cracked sound at the absurdity of it all, and told the wide-eyed children that if the world was going to end, at least it had chosen to be beautiful while it killed them.
Outside, the great frost of 1709 raged like an avenging angel. Inside, a handful of fires, fed by cradle boards, hope, and the last sticks of a child's toy, still glowed, and Europe clung to the 26th dawn with raw, bleeding hands. By the 27th day, time itself had frozen. Mornings no longer began with the sun. They began when the watcher by the fire judged that the darkness had thinned enough to risk another day. A hand would reach out from the nest of blankets, feed the last carefully hoarded sliver of chairback or cradleboard to the embers, and the household stirred like a single creature waking from uneasy hibernation. People rose in the clothes they had slept in, every stitch they owned stiff with frost and sweat. Breath bloomed white, hung a moment, and fell as snow onto collar and beard. No one spoke above a murmur. Loud voices belonged to another life. The first task was always the same: coax the fire back to life, blow gently on the coals until a tongue of flame accepted the offering and agreed to burn a little longer.
Water was fetched before full light. Someone, usually the strongest still able, wrapped rags around the bucket handle so skin would not stick, chipped the night's new skin of ice from the well or the cauldron of melted snow, and carried the precious liquid back, slopping only a few drops, each one mourned. The bucket was set immediately beside the fire so it would not freeze again before breakfast. Breakfast, when it existed, was a ritual of subtraction. The pot from the night before was reheated. Yesterday's broth, already thin, was thinned again with snow water. A single rye crust, black and hard as slate, was grated into it. The smell that rose was more memory than food, yet children leaned over their bowls and inhaled as though it were feast day soup. Animals were tended next. The barn door was opened only wide enough for one body to slip through, then shoved shut against the wind. Inside, the air was warmer, but sharp with the smell of starvation.
The cow that had given nothing for 3 days was milked anyway, a few blue drops that froze on the lip of the pail. Hens were lifted from their perches and tucked inside coats to thaw their feet before they could be set down to peck at a handful of chaff. The goat that had stopped eating was coaxed with a mouthful of precious salt, licked from a human palm. Outside, the village moved like a single slow heartbeat. Figures appeared and disappeared between cottages, bent almost double under bundles of sticks or straw. No one walked upright anymore. The wind punished pride. Paths between houses had become tunnels dug through drifts, roofed with snow, lit by the faint gray glow that filtered through the white. People met in these tunnels without greeting. Words cost breath. Simply touched a sleeve or shoulder to say, "I see you. You are still here." Children had become small, solemn adults. They carried kindling in arms too thin for the load, stacked it with exact care, then stood on tiptoe to peer into the pot and judge whether today there would be enough.
They no longer asked for more. They had learned the shape of hunger and the weight of silence. By midday, the light was already failing. The sun, when it appeared at all, was a dull coin behind veils of cloud, giving neither warmth nor cheer. People worked faster then, driven by the knowledge that darkness brought the coldest hours. Wood was split into ever smaller pieces. A log that would once have burned an evening now had to last 3. Furniture that had survived the night before was eyed with new calculation. The last bench, the broken loom, the chest that held a grandmother's wedding linen. At dusk, the village drew inward. Families gathered in the house with the strongest roof or the largest hearth, pooling the last of their heat and hope. Bodies pressed close beneath every blanket and hide, animals brought inside to share their faint warmth. The fire was banked to a single glowing eye, watched by whoever drew the short straw for the first watch.
Conversation, if it came at all, was about practicalities. Whose cow might still have a little milk tomorrow? Whether the ice on the river was thick enough now to risk a final try for fish? How many more days could be stolen before the roofs collapsed or the food simply ran out? And yet, in the long hours when the wind eased and the snow settled into stillness, something else happened. Hands found other hands in the dark. A child's head settled on a grandfather's chest and listened to a heart that still beat. Someone began to hum, an old plow song or a lullaby or a hymn half remembered, and others joined until the tiny flame in the hearth seemed to burn brighter for the thread of sound. Outside, the 27th night of the Great Frost of 1709 pressed its full weight upon Europe. Inside, the last small fires glowed, the last thin broth steamed, the last careful breaths were drawn, and the rhythm, slow, deliberate, unbreakable, went on. By the 28th day, the forests had become cathedrals of silence and hunger.
A man entering them now did so the way one enters a church during a funeral, head bowed, breath held, aware that every sound might be judged. The snow was so deep that even the tallest pines seemed stunted. Their lower branches disappeared entirely, leaving only green crowns floating above a white void. Every trunk wore a thick coat of rime, and when the wind moved high overhead, the whole forest chimed softly, like 1,000 glass bells, too delicate to ring aloud. Deer had become ghosts of themselves. They moved in single file, following the leader's plunging trail, ribs sharp beneath winter coats that no longer shone. When one paused to nose the snow for buried bark, the others waited in absolute stillness, as though movement itself cost too much. Their tracks told the story plainly, long, desperate searches ending in nothing. Then the slow turn back toward the villages where the scent of human desperation sometimes meant a forgotten crust or a spilled handful of grain. Wolves, by contrast, had grown bolder.
Their pads barely broke the crusted snow. They traveled on top of the drifts like pale shadows. At dusk, their trails ringed the hamlets in perfect geometry, measuring, testing, learning exactly how far hunger would drive the two-legged creatures inside. When a pack began to sing, the sound rose and fell with the wind, now close, now impossibly distant, until no one could tell whether the howl came from the forest edge or from inside their own ribcage. Foxes had taken to following human tracks. A hunter returning empty-handed might find a small red shadow 20 paces behind, patient as death, waiting to see what scraps despair might leave. The birds that remained were the tough ones, ravens, hooded crows, a few coal tits no bigger than a child's fist. They moved in short, angry bursts from branch to branch, scolding the silence. A raven that found a frozen mouse considered it a banquet, and defended it with gothic screams that carried for miles across the white. Men who still dared the woods did so only in pairs, and only for the gravest reasons.
They carried no guns. Powder was too precious, and the report would bring every wolf within a league running. Instead, they bore axes and long knives, moving in the slow crouch hunters use when stalking dangerous game, because the forest itself had become the quarry and the predator both. They sought deadfall that the snow had not yet buried, or the inner bark of birch that could be chewed or boiled into something that almost resembled food. Each stick gathered was tucked inside the coat to keep it from freezing brittle. Each step was a negotiation with the snow. Lift the knee high, place the foot gently, pray the crust held. They saw the wolves often now, not as fleeting shadows, but as deliberate spectators. A pack would sit in a half circle at the edge of a clearing, yellow eyes unblinking, waiting to see whether the men would drop from exhaustion or turn back empty-handed. Once, 2 woodcutters near Liège found themselves being herded, the wolves appearing first to the left, then to the right, then behind, until the men stumbled into their own village street, trembling too violently to speak.
Yet even on the 28th day, the forest still gave moments that stole the breath for reasons other than fear. Late in the short afternoon, when the light turned the color of pale honey, the snowfields between the trees blazed suddenly, as though lit from beneath. Every crystal caught the sun and threw it back in a silent explosion of rose and gold. A man standing in that light forgot for one heartbeat that he was starving, forgot the wolves, forgot the ache in his frost-blackened toes. He simply stared, mouth open beneath his ice-crusted beard, while the forest burned around him without heat. Then the sun slipped lower, the gold bled out, and the white silence returned colder than before, as though the beauty had been payment exacted for the right to go on suffering. The men shouldered their meager bundles and began the long, slow walk home, following their own tracks before the wind could erase them. Behind them, the wolves rose and stretched, patient as winter itself, and began to follow at a distance that was neither hurried nor afraid.
Inside the cottages that night, the fires burned a little lower, the broth was a little thinner, and the stories told to wide-eyed children grew shorter because no one had strength left for long tales of summer. But the rhythm, slow, deliberate, stubborn, went on. 28 days, 28 nights, and still the small defiant flames glowed against the dark. By the 30th day, the sun had become a rumor. It rose late and sullen, a dull pewter disk that gave no warmth and barely enough light to tell snow from sky. By early afternoon, it was gone again, bleeding out behind the same iron clouds that had hung overhead for weeks. Nights began at 3 o'clock and lasted until the watcher by the fire decided the darkness had thinned enough to risk calling it morning. Inside the cottages, time was measured not in hours, but in burnings. A single tallow candle, cut into 6 pieces, became the household clock. When the first stub guttered out, it was time to feed the animals.
When the third sank into its own wax, the thin midday broth was warmed. When the last one drowned, the family lay down in their clothes and waited for the cold to decide whether they would wake again. People no longer slept so much as drifted in and out of a gray half-consciousness, always within arm's reach of the fire. Children were tucked against adults like hot water bottles. Dogs and cats burrowed wherever flesh still held a trace of warmth. The air inside was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, smoke, and the faint, sweet stench of starvation. Breath froze on blankets in delicate fern patterns that no one had the strength to brush away. Stories had almost stopped. The old tales of summer and harvest felt like mockery now. Instead, when someone spoke in the long dark, it was to count. How many sticks of kindling remained? How many beans were left in the jar? How many days a single hen might still be kept alive for the hope of one more egg?
The numbers grew smaller every night, spoken softly, the way one recites a rosary whose beads are running out. Light itself became sacred. A single flame reflected in a dozen watching eyes looked like a captive star. When it sank too low, the watcher, whoever had drawn the short straw or lost the last game of knuckles, fed it another splinter of cradleboard or prayer book cover, and the household breathed with it, a collective inhale at the brief flare, a slow exhale as the wood caught. Outside, the nights were so cold that sound itself seemed to freeze. A dog barking half a mile away rang like a bell in a tomb. The ice on the rivers groaned in low, continuous organ notes as it thickened another finger's breadth. Once, just after midnight, the northern sky flowered with pale green curtains of light, the aurora borealis, a thing most of these people had never seen and had no name for. They watched through cracks in the shutters, too awed even to whisper,
afraid the beauty would notice them and take offense.
Children began to forget what sunlight felt like on bare skin. They asked, in the careful voices they had learned, whether summer was a story grown-ups had made up to keep them quiet. Parents had no answer that would not cost too much breath. Yet even on the 30th night, small rituals held. Someone always hummed, 3 notes, over and over, the fragment of a lullaby no one could remember whole. Someone always laid a hand on the head of the youngest child, feeling for the faint pulse at the temple, the way sailors once felt for wind. Someone always whispered the same words into the dark, so softly that the frost itself might not hear. Tomorrow. Just tomorrow. Outside, the great frost of 1709 kept its perfect, merciless silence. Inside, 30 small fires, some no larger than a beggar's handful of coals, still answered with their stubborn, trembling glow. And Europe, 30 nights into the longest winter any living soul could remember, breathed with them. One more time. One more night. One more fragile, defiant heartbeat against the dark. By the 31st day, the frost had walked into the cellars like an unwelcome guest who would not leave. It sat in the corners where the stone walls wept slow tears of ice. It pressed against barrels until the hoops groaned and the staves split with small, sharp cracks that sounded in the night like distant gunshots. Potatoes, once proud and firm, now lay in their bidons like stones pulled from a riverbed. Gray, split, weeping a thin, starchy water that froze again into pale stalactites. Turnips had burst their skins and collapsed inward, leaving only hollow shells that crumbled at a touch. Even the apples, those last defiant globes of autumn, were solid balls of ice, their perfume locked away behind a glassy prison. People descended the narrow stairs with candles held low, moving as though the frost might hear them and take offense. They spoke in whispers, if they spoke at all. The air down there was so cold it burned the lungs. Breath fell from the mouth like flour, dusting shoulders and eyelashes white.
They worked by feel more than sight. A hand laid gently on a sack of rye, judged whether the grain still shifted or had fused into a single block. A knife blade tested the hardness of a ham. If the iron rang instead of cutting, the ham was carried upstairs to be sawn into chunks over the fire. Onions were cradled against the breast inside the coat on the journey up, so that the faint warmth of a human heart might coax them back to something resembling food. Children were sent down only for the lightest tasks, carrying up one frozen cabbage at a time, or laying a square of old blanket over the diminishing row of jars. They learned to walk with their arms held slightly out from their sides, the way priests carry the sacrament, because to stumble against a barrel could mean the loss of a week's bread. Cooking became alchemy performed over dying embers. A single frozen beet might be held directly in the flames until the skin blackened and split, then dropped hissing into the pot where it surrendered its last faint sweetness.
Grain was pounded between stones until it surrendered a coarse, bitter flour that stuck in the throat but filled the belly for another day. The smell that rose from these pots was no longer of kitchens and comfort. It was of earth and smoke and the faint metallic tang of desperation. Yet even on the 31st day, small ceremonies persisted. When a carrot, miraculously still yielding, was found among its ruined cousins, it was carried upstairs like a relic. The family gathered round while the mother shaved it into the thinnest possible curls, dividing them with the gravity of communion wafers. The children closed their eyes to taste better, and for a moment, the ghost of summer, sun on leaves, the snap of a fresh-pulled root, walked among them.
At night, the cellars were checked one last time. A candle stub was left burning in a dish of fat, its tiny flame a prayer against total darkness. Someone always touched the wall on the way out, feeling for the faint warmth that meant the house above still lived.
Upstairs, the fire was banked to a single coal no larger than a child's heart. The family lay down in their clothes, pressed close beneath every rag and hide they owned. Outside, the 31st night of the Great Frost of 1709 settled its weight upon the village like a stone on a grave. Inside, one candle burned lower, one coal glowed, one careful breath followed another. 31 days, 31 nights, and still the small, stubborn flame of human attention, to a frozen beet, to a cracked barrel, to the last handful of grain, refused to go out. By the 33rd day, childhood itself had been put on rations. Schools stood empty, their doors drifted shut, the ink in the inkwells frozen solid into black glass. The world of children had shrunk to the circle of light thrown by a single hearth, and the schoolroom had moved there too, a small cleared space on the packed earth floor, a slate balanced on a child's knees, a primer whose pages were now mostly ash in the fire.
Lessons began only when the fire was strong enough to spare warmth for thought. A mother or grandmother sat with the youngest on her lap, tracing letters in the soot on the hearthstones, because paper was too precious to waste on practice. The older ones copied verses onto broken shards of slate, pressing hard so the words would last until tomorrow. Mistakes were erased with a damp rag kept unfrozen inside someone's shirt. Every motion was slow, deliberate, reverent. Arithmetic was taught with beans or pebbles, pulled one by one from a jar. "How many do we have left?" the father would ask, and the lesson became real. 7 beans today, 5 tomorrow if we eat 2, 3 the day after. The numbers were not abstract any longer, they were supper. History shrank to what could be remembered without books. Grandfathers told of the last great frost their own grandfathers had spoken of, voices low so the cold would not hear and grow proud.
Bible stories were repeated until every child could recite the flight into Egypt or the feeding of the 5,000, because those were tales of hunger and miraculous survival, and the children understood them now in their bones. Reading was done aloud, one precious page at a time, because candle stubs were counted like gold coins. When the light died, the story simply paused mid-sentence and waited for the next evening, the way everything now waited. Water for thawing, bread for rising, spring for coming. Discipline was gentle and rare. A child who fidgeted too close to the fire and wasted heat was simply pulled back into a parent's arms and held until stillness returned. Tears were wiped with thumbs too numb to feel them properly. Scolding cost breath no one could spare. Yet learning still happened, deeper and truer than in any summer classroom. Children learned the exact weight of a log that would burn for 1 hour. They learned to read the frost flowers on the window the way sailors once read stars. Thick blossoms meant colder still tomorrow.
They learned the difference between the silence of snow falling and the silence of snow about to fall harder. They learned that hope was not a loud thing. It was the quiet voice that said, "again," when a letter was traced crooked for the 3rd time. At dusk, the slates were put away with the same care once given to Sunday clothes. The children were fed their quarter bowl of thin gruel, then tucked against whichever adult body still held the most warmth. Before sleep, one of them, always the same small girl in a village near Namur, would ask the question that had replaced all bedtime prayers. "Will the sun be bigger tomorrow?" And the answer, night after night, was the same soft lie,
spoken without hesitation, because some lessons were more important than truth. Yes, my heart, a little bigger every day. Outside, the 33rd night of the Great Frost of 1709 pressed its white palm against the windows. Inside, a child's finger traced shaky A in the soot, erased it, traced it again, and the small, stubborn flame of learning, like the small, stubborn flame on the hearth, refused to die. By the 34th day, clothing was no longer something one wore. It was something one inhabited, like a fragile second skin that had to be fed, mended, and coaxed into keeping its wearer alive. Garments froze into armor the moment they were taken outside. Wool turned to board, leather to iron. A cloak left on a peg overnight could be stood in the corner like a suit of mail. Sleeves rang when they struck one another. To put on a coat that had cooled for even an hour was to invite a shock of pain so sharp it stole the breath. Children learned to sleep in almost everything they owned, peeling off only the outermost layers so it could be thawed and beaten soft again by the fire in the morning. Mothers developed rituals as precise as any monks. Before dawn, they rose, silent, and laid the stiff garments across chairs closest to the hearth, turning them the way one turns roasting meat. They rubbed tallow into cracked boot leather with fingers already split and bleeding, whispering to the hide as though it were a sick animal. Mittens were turned inside out and held over the flames until the ice in the lining melted and steamed, then beaten against the table leg to restore suppleness. A single tear in a sleeve was catastrophe. Thread was counted stitch by stitch, and the patch beneath it layered from whatever scraps still held warmth. An old petticoat, a dead grandfather's shirt, the felt from a horse's saddle pad. Children were dressed in the half-light like small, solemn knights. First the innermost shirt, already worn soft and smelling of smoke and skin. Then a second shirt, then a vest, then a jerkin, then a coat, each layer tugged and settled so no cold could creep between. Stockings were pulled over stockings until legs looked comically thick, then breeches tied tight at the knees to keep the bulk from working downward. Scarves were wound so many times that only eyes showed, bright and watchful above the wool. The final act was always the same, a parent's hands pressing the child's shoulders, feeling for gaps. Then a quick kiss dropped onto the only patch of exposed forehead before the hood went up. Outside, the garments fought the frost and lost ground every minute. Snow worked its way into cuffs and collars, melted against the neck, then froze again into a ring of ice that rubbed skin raw. Boots that had been greased at dawn were stiff again by noon. Toes went numb, then burning, then mercifully numb a second time. When a child came back inside, the undressing was performed with the gravity of disarming a soldier. Mittens peeled off like wet hides, coat unbuttoned with fingers that trembled too much to grip, scarves unwound until a small flushed face finally appeared, triumphant and half frozen. Yet even on the 34th day, beauty lived in the small things. A mother finishing the last stitch on a patched mitten held it up to the firelight, turning it so the flames showed through the new darn like threads of gold. A little boy discovered that if he breathed on the frost flowers inside the window, they melted into tiny clear patches through which he could see the moon, and he called his sisters to share the porthole he had made.
An old woman, sewing by touch because her eyes were failing, still managed to work a tiny red thread into the shape of a heart on her grandson's cuff. So the cold will know there is love in there and be gentle. At night the family lay down like a single, many-layered creature, cocooned in quilts that had been mended so often they were more patched than original cloth. The outermost blanket was drawn up over all of them, And the warmth they generated, small, animal, precious, pooled in the center and was jealously guarded. Someone always placed a hand on the pile, feeling for the faint rise and fall that meant everyone still breathed. Outside, the 34th night of the Great Frost of 1709 wrapped the village in its white fist. Inside, a patched coat steamed gently on a chair. A child's mitten, dried with its thumb turned up in an unconscious gesture of hope. And the slow, deliberate work of keeping bodies alive inside their fragile fabric shells went on. One more stitch, one more layer, one more night.
By the 36th day, the storm no longer knocked. It simply walked in. It came as a wall of white that swallowed the last gray light of afternoon. One moment the village was visible, muffled, pale, but still there. The next, it was gone. The world ended 10 paces from every door. Snow did not fall so much as hurl itself sideways, driven by a wind that sounded like every wolf in Europe howling at once. Inside, the cottages became caves again, deeper and darker than before. Shutters slammed, although no hand touched them. Chimneys roared in reverse, vomiting smoke back into rooms until eyes streamed and throats rasped. Snow sifted through keyholes in needle-fine streams that stung like hot ash. People moved only when they must, and then on hands and knees, because the floor was the only place the air was breathable. The fire fought for its life. Each new log was laid with the reverence once reserved for the host. Sparks flew upward and died against the ceiling like doomed fireflies.
When the flames sank too low, someone crawled forward, face wrapped in a shawl, and blew gently on the coals until the red eye flared again. The household breathed with it. Inhale when the flame rose, exhale when it settled. A single lung shared among many bodies. Outside, the storm rewrote the village in its own language. Roofs groaned under sudden, impossible weight. One in a hamlet near Dijon collapsed with a sound like a cannon shot, burying a family of 7. Their neighbors heard nothing over the wind. Paths that had taken weeks to tunnel were filled solid in an hour. A horse left tied in a yard was found the next morning, half buried, standing upright, eyes frozen shut, mane encased in ice thick as armor. Animals sensed the end coming. Cows lowed once, a deep, mournful note that carried through the walls, then stood silent, heads lowered, waiting. Hens huddled into the smallest possible balls of feathers and ceased even to cluck. A dog that had whined all night finally curled against its master's legs and grew still.
Children were no longer told stories. They were pressed so tightly beneath blankets that only their eyes showed, wide and unblinking. When the roof beams cracked like breaking bones, a collective shiver ran through the pile of bodies, but no one cried out. Crying cost warmth. Time dissolved. There was no night, no day, only the endless white roaring. The only clock was the fire's heartbeat. Flare, settle, flare again. When a log burned through too quickly, the watcher fed it the last wooden spoon or the child's broken toy sled without asking permission. Possession had ceased to matter. Survival was the only owner now. Yet, even inside the heart of the beast, small acts of refusal persisted. A grandmother in Brittany used her own body to block the worst draft from the door, lying across the threshold until her daughters dragged her back, blue-lipped and half-conscious. A boy in Swabia kept a single pea in his pocket all day, rolling it between mittened fingers like a talisman, whispering to it that spring would come and it would grow into a vine tall enough to climb out of this winter.
A priest near Rouen went from house to house, crouched on all fours, carrying the viaticum in a leather pouch against his chest because 3 parishioners had asked for absolution before what might be the end. The storm spoke in a voice older than churches. It tore tiles from roofs and flung them like playing cards. It drove snow through cracks no wider than a knife blade. It pressed against the walls until the timber cried aloud. And still the fires, 36 small, desperate fires, answered with their thin, trembling glow. Outside, the great frost of 1709 raged like the wrath of God. Inside, Europe measured its life in sparks, in heartbeats, in the slow, stubborn rhythm of breath refused to the storm. One more log, one more hour, one more night. And the 36th day was not yet finished with them. By the 39th day, the animals had become the truest measure of how close the edge really was. A cow that no longer turned her head when spoken to was a warning. A goat that refused even a mouthful of precious hay was a sentence.
A hen that sat motionless with her eyes half closed was already halfway to death. People read these signs the way sailors once read the sky, and every small decline was felt in the stomach like a fist. Feeding had become a liturgy. At first light, what little light there was, the barn door was opened only wide enough for one body to slip through, then slammed shut against the wind. Inside, the air was thick with the sour smell of starvation and the faint warmth of crowded breath. The farmer moved down the row of stalls, speaking each animal's name softly, the way a priest names the dying. A handful of hay, measured the night before, no more, no less, was placed in each manger. The rustle of stems sounded loud in the hush, almost indecent. Cows ate slowly now, jaws moving in painful, deliberate circles, eyes filmed with exhaustion. The strongest pushed forward, the weakest stood back and waited for what the others left, which was never enough.
Farmers stood among them with a switch or a gentle hand, enforcing a justice that broke their hearts. The milking cow first, then the pregnant doe, then the ox that might still pull a plow if spring ever came. The rest waited, ribs heaving like bellows with holes burned through. Water was carried in pails hugged against the chest so it would not freeze before it reached the trough. Often it did anyway, forming a skin of ice that had to be broken with a fist, already cracked and bleeding. Animals drank in small, desperate swallows, tongues rasping against the ice that reformed almost instantly. Children were sent into the barns with warm stones wrapped in rags. Their small bodies could squeeze through narrower gaps without letting in too much cold. They laid the stones against the flanks of the weakest beasts and sat beside them, humming the same 3-note tune their mothers used at bedtime, because sound itself seemed to carry a little warmth. When an animal finally lay down and would not rise, the family gathered.
There was no time for sentiment. The throat was cut quickly, the blood caught in a bowl to thicken the soup, the carcass dragged into the yard because the ground was too hard for burial. The hide was scraped while it still held a trace of warmth. The meat divided, some for the pot tonight, some salted with the last grains of precious salt, some smoked over the hearth, until the cottage reeked of a butcher shop and a church combined. Afterward, the empty stall was not spoken of. The hay that would have gone to the lost creature was divided among the others without comment. The children were kept away until the blood froze black on the floor. Yet even on the 39th day, tenderness survived. A boy in Normandy
spent an hour every dawn curled against the oldest cow, lending her his own small heat, whispering that she only had to last a little longer. A girl near Cologne braided red yarn, saved from her mother's wedding shawl, into the mane of the last horse, so death will see she is loved and pass her by.
An old farmer in the Ardennes was seen kissing his dying ox between the eyes before leading it outside, apologizing aloud for the betrayal of 30 years of shared work. Inside the cottages that night, the broth was a shade thicker, the fire burned a fraction higher, and no one looked toward the corner where an empty collar or a single feather on the floor marked the place a life had been. Outside, the 39th night of the great frost of 1709 waited, patient and absolute. Inside, the remaining animals breathed their slow, cloudy breaths, and the people tending them moved in the same rhythm, handful of hay, measured swallow of water, gentle palm against a trembling flank, counting heartbeats that were no longer entirely their own. One more morning, one more handful, one more stubborn refusal to let the cold win everything at once. By the 40th day, to leave the village was to enter into a covenant with death that might or might not be kept. The roads were not merely buried, they had ceased to exist.
In their place lay a vast, rolling plain of snow, smooth as beaten cream in some places, ridged like frozen surf in others. A traveler could walk for hours and pass the rusted wheel of a cart jutting up like the rib of some dead leviathan, or stumble upon a milestone so encased in ice that the Roman numerals looked like runes from a forgotten age. Those who still had to move, to fetch a midwife, to barter the last of the rye for salt, to check on an elder living alone, did so on sleds now, low and wide, drawn by the last horses that could still pull. The animals were blanketed until only their eyes and nostrils showed, and even then ice formed on their lashes and had to be melted away with mittened thumbs. Every harness strap was checked twice, every runner greased with tallow that froze almost as fast as it was applied. Loads were lashed with rawhide that snapped like glass if tightened too quickly. Departure was a ceremony.
The entire household gathered at the door. The traveler was wrapped one final time, scarf over scarf, hood over hood, until he looked twice his normal size. Someone pressed a hot stone against his belly beneath the layers. Someone else tucked a pinch of salt into his mitten, for luck and to keep the blood moving. A child was lifted to kiss the frost-stiff cheek. Then the sled was pushed forward, runners groaning, and the village watched until the small dark shape was swallowed into the white. Travel itself was measured in breaths. 10 steps, pause, listen. 20 steps, test the crust with a staff. If the snow rang hollow beneath the pole, the route was abandoned and another sought. A horse that stumbled twice was turned immediately. A third stumble meant the journey was over, no matter how close the destination. Men learned to read the snow the way sailors read waves. A faint bluish tint meant ice strong enough to bear weight. A yellowish sheen meant death lying in wait.
The wind was the true master. It rose without warning, erasing every track in minutes, turning sky and ground the same blinding white. More than one party simply stopped where they stood, dug a hollow with their mittens, pulled the sled over themselves like a coffin lid, and waited for the world to remember which way was up. Some were found in spring, sitting upright, faces calm, as though they had merely paused to rest. Yet even on the 40th day, necessity drove people outward. A woman near Trier walked 6 miles through drifting snow, carrying her dead child wrapped in a blanket, because the priest in the next valley was the only one who could still say the words over a Christian grave. She arrived with her own eyelashes frozen together, laid the small bundle on the altar, and only then allowed herself to faint. A boy of 12 drove a sled loaded with a single sack of barley to his grandmother's cottage, following a rope he had strung from house to house the week before.
He found her alive, sitting upright by cold ashes, and carried her home across the sled like another sack of grain, singing all the way so the wolves would know he was not afraid. When a sled did return, the entire village turned out. Figures appeared out of the white as if conjured, hands reaching to steady the horse, to lift the traveler down, to unwrap the layers of ice-crusted cloth until a human face finally emerged, red, raw, but alive. The first question was never, "What news?" but, "Did you bring wood?" Or, "Was there salt?" Only after the answers came the embrace, the tears frozen on cheeks before they could fall. Inside the cottages that night, the returned traveler was given the warmest corner, the thickest broth, the last spoonful of honey melted in hot water. Children sat wide-eyed while the journey was told in short, hoarse sentences. How the snow sang under the runners, how the horse wept ice from its eyes, how the world had become so white that direction itself was a memory.
And every listener understood that the story was not of adventure, but of a debt repaid, one more day borrowed from the frost. Outside, the 40th night settled its full weight upon the land. Inside, a sled stood just within the door, runners still dripping, harness hung to thaw, ready for the next journey that could not be refused. Because even on the 40th day, some things, birth, death, hunger, love, still demanded that a path be made through the white silence, one deliberate, terrifying step at a time. By the 42nd day, a letter was no longer paper. It was a living thing, fragile and almost sacred. It had to be carried against the skin so the courier's own heart could keep the ink from freezing into black ice. Envelopes were wrapped first in wool, then in oiled cloth, then sewn into a small pouch that hung beneath the shirt, right over the breastbone. When a courier finally reached a village, the first thing he did was not speak, but pull out that pouch, still warm, and hand it over as though delivering a newborn bird.
Villagers gathered in silence when a sled was heard. No one shouted or ran. Running wasted strength and risked a fall. They simply appeared at doorways, faces muffled to the eyes, and waited. The courier, half dead with cold, beard a mask of ice, would fumble with numb fingers until the packet was free. Then the letter was passed from mitten to mitten like a coal that must not be dropped. Inside the chosen cottage, the ritual began. The outermost wrapping was peeled away with the care of unwrapping the host. When the paper finally appeared, stiff, sometimes cracked along the folds, it was laid on the warmest stone by the hearth and covered with a warmed cloth. Only when the creases softened and the wax sealed relaxed was it opened. Someone who could still read without spectacles did the honors, voice low so the frost would not hear and grow jealous. A single sheet could feed a village for a week. A son writing from Lisbon that he was alive and warm.
A daughter in service at a great house, sending 3 silver coins sewn into the hem. A priest in another valley confirming that the sacraments still traveled, even if slowly. Or sometimes only 3 words, "We endure also." The paper was read aloud until every soul knew it by heart. Then it was folded again, smaller and smaller, until it could be tucked inside the family Bible or sewn into the lining of a coat, carried next to the skin like an extra heartbeat. Children learned to write on slates with charcoal because paper was too precious for practice. But when a real letter came, they were allowed to touch it once. one careful fingertip on the place where their name appeared. That touch was their first lesson in distance, in longing, in the thin thread that still tied the frozen world together. Couriers became something close to saints. They were fed first, given the warmest corner, their frost-cracked hands wrapped around bowls of broth they were too tired to taste.
Before they slept, someone always asked the same question, softly. "Will you carry an answer back?" And the answer was always the same, even when the courier could barely speak for exhaustion. "If God and the snow allow." Then a new letter would be begun, words chosen with the gravity of last confessions, folded into the same small pouch and laid against another heart for the return journey. Outside, the 42nd night of the Great Frost of 1709 kept its ancient silence. Inside, a scrap of paper no larger than a man's hand lay warming by the fire, carrying 3 words, or 30, or 3 silver coins, or simply a name. Enough to keep hope breathing for one more day. By the 44th day, the forest no longer allowed haste. A man who walked quickly broke through the crust and sank to the hip, and the effort of pulling free could cost the strength needed to return home. So hunters moved as though underwater. One deliberate step, pause, listen, another step. Breath was kept shallow. Loud breathing carried too far and told every hungry thing exactly where warm blood walked. They hunted now with the patience of herons. A snare was checked only once every 3 days. Oftener, and the fox would learn the scent of man. A man could lie belly down on a ridge for hours, unmoving, watching a patch of snow where a single blade of grass still showed, waiting for the faint tremor that meant a rabbit was nibbling beneath the white roof of its burrow. When the moment came, the arrow or the thrown stick had to be perfect. There would be no second chance, and a wounded animal that escaped was meat the wolves would claim instead. Tracks were read like scripture. Wolf prints meant detour. Fox prints meant possible snare nearby. The tiny stitched line of a field mouse meant life still moved under the snow, and where mice were, an owl or a marten might soon follow. The forest itself had grown watchful. Branches hung so heavy with ice that a careless shoulder brushing one could bring down a glittering avalanche loud enough to empty the woods of every living thing for half a mile. Men learned to pass beneath the laden boughs with arms raised like penitents, accepting the cold shower of crystals down the neck as the price of silence. When a hunter did bring something home, a single hare, a wood pigeon stiff with cold, once, unbelievably, a young roe deer that had starved and frozen upright against a tree, the return was ceremonial. The village appeared without a word spoken, figures at doorways, hands ready. The animal was carried in on a sled or across shoulders like a holy relic. Children were allowed one touch of the fur before it disappeared into the kitchen to be skinned with the same knife that had yesterday cut firewood and tomorrow might cut a coffin. Meat was divided with solemn justice. The hunter's family first, then the weakest households, then a portion hung high in the coldest corner, so the wolves outside could smell it and know the village was not yet finished. Blood was caught in a bowl and thickened with the last handful of barley. Even the bones were cracked at once for marrow, because waiting until tomorrow risked finding them frozen too solid to break.
Yet even on the 44th day, the forest still gave moments that stopped the heart for reasons other than hunger. A hunter resting against a pine at noon looked up and saw the sun strike a pendant of ice so perfectly that it flung a perfect circle of rainbow across the snow. 7 colors, bright as summer flowers, lasting no longer than 3 breaths. He forgot to breathe with them, and when the colors vanished, he found tears frozen on his lashes like tiny jewels. Another man, checking a snare at dusk, found it empty but for a single perfect feather. An owl's, barred, brown, and white, placed as though in payment.
He carried it home inside his mitten and gave it to his youngest daughter, who tucked it behind her ear and refused to take it out even when she slept. Inside the cottages that night, the smell of roasting meat, the first real meat in weeks, rose like incense. Children who had forgotten the taste of fat fell asleep with greasy fingers in their mouths.
Someone began to sing, an old hunting song about green woods and full bellies, and no one told him to stop, even though every note cost warmth. Outside, the 44th night of the Great Frost of 1709 waited, patient as stone. Inside, a single hare fed 12, a pigeon's bones flavored broth for 20, and a perfect owl's feather rested against a sleeping child's cheek like a promise the forest had whispered and the winter had not yet managed to silence. By the 45th night, the village had only one clock left, and its name was the human voice. When the last sliver of candle guttered out, when the final ember was banked beneath ash to nurse it until morning, the darkness inside the cottages became absolute. Then, and only then, the storyteller was allowed to begin. They did not raise their voices. Loudness belonged to summer. Instead, they spoke from low in the chest, the way one speaks in church or at a deathbed, letting the words fall into the hush like single snowflakes, slow, deliberate, perfect.
Children were arranged in concentric rings around the hearth, smallest closest to the dying glow, larger ones behind, adults forming the outer wall of warmth. No one fidgeted. Movement cost heat. A head that nodded forward in sleep was simply tucked against a neighboring shoulder and left there. Breath rose and mingled above the circle, a faint pale cloud that carried the mingled scents of smoke, wool, and the last trace of meat broth. The stories were never hurried. An old woman might take half the night to tell of the winter of 1642, when her own grandmother kept 9 people alive by boiling boot leather with wild garlic and a single prayer repeated until the words themselves seemed to give off warmth. She paused after every sentence, letting the silence settle, letting the children feel how long a winter night could truly be. When she reached the morning, the leather finally softened, and the youngest child tasted soup for the first time in a month, she stopped altogether. No one asked for the ending. They simply breathed together in the dark, tasting the ghost of that soup on their own tongues.
A grandfather told of a fox who bargained with winter itself, trading his beautiful red coat for one meal of fat hen. Each night, he added one more detail, the exact weight of the hen, the way the frost sparkled on the fox's whiskers when he smiled, stretching the tale across a week because the children begged to know what happened when spring finally came, and the fox stood naked and ashamed in the green wood. The ending was always the same. The other animals clothed him again, piece by piece, because even a trickster belongs to the forest. The children fell asleep believing that belonging was warmer than any coat. Sometimes the stories were so small they barely qualified as tales at all. The time the miller's cat caught a mouse so thin its ribs rattled like dice. The winter the priest lost his voice and preached the Christmas sermon in gestures so beautiful that half the village wept. The single rose hip a little boy found under the snow and carried home in his mitten for 3 miles because his mother had once said they tasted like summer. The fire was never fed during a story. The storyteller's art was to finish exactly when the last coal dimmed to a ruby eye, so that the final word and the final glow died together, leaving only the rhythm of breath and heartbeat in the dark. Outside, the 45th night of the Great Frost of 1709 pressed its white face against the windows and listened. Inside, an old voice spoke the same closing words every night, soft as a lullaby and fierce as a vow. And the winter heard them, and the winter was long, but the story was longer.
Then the silence came, perfect, shared, unbreakable. And somewhere in that silence a child smiled in sleep, dreaming of green woods, of a naked fox wearing a coat sewn from kindness, of a single rosehip that still tasted like summer after 45 nights of ice. The frost raged. The story endured.
And so, on the 50th night of the Great Frost of 1709, the last candle was gently snuffed between wet fingers, the last ember covered with a tender palm of ash, and the village breathed out together, one long, slow sigh that rose through chimneys and mingled with the quiet falling snow. Outside, the frost stood watch, white and perfect and merciless. Inside, 50 small circles of warmth, 50 stubborn heartbeats settled into the same ancient rhythm. Inhale, endure. Exhale, endure. The wind softened, as though it too had grown weary. Snow kept falling, but now it fell like a lullaby, covering tracks, roofs, roads, and graves alike with the same tender hand. In one cottage, a child murmured in sleep, dreaming of green woods that would come again. In another, an old woman smiled at nothing, remembering a rosehip that once tasted like summer. In every home, a hand found another hand beneath the blankets, held tight, and did not let go. The Great Frost of 1709 had taken almost everything,
But not the rhythm, not the story, not the quiet, unbreakable promise whispered from heart to heart in the dark. We are still here. We are still warm. We are still us. Sleep now, traveler. Let the snow fall, let the fires bank low. Let 50 small villages across a frozen continent breathe together in the hush. Spring is a long way off, but the heartbeat goes on. Slow, deliberate, eternal. Good night.